So probably the biggest internet policy news of the last year was the FCC's open internet order, which reclassified broadband as a telecommunications services regulated under Title II of the 1934 Communications Act. It was and remains highly controversial, with proponents arguing that it's the best way to ensure some kind of net neutrality. Opponents arguing that it will affect incentives to invest. And it was a good political show, too, with the FCC seemingly ready to move towards some kind of use of Section 706 to do net neutrality until the president made a statement endorsing Title II, and then the FCC sort of seemed to follow that course. And this upset Republicans in Congress as well as some Democrats, and so we've had lots of hearings, threats to cut the FCC's budget, and so on. And of course, this is being challenged in court. So all of this raises interesting questions also about how the FCC interacts with other parts of the government. And these are the sorts of questions we're going to discuss today, in addition to some of the substance of the rule. So the panelists we have today are not quite going down the line here, but I'm going to list them in alphabetical order. Rebecca Arbogast, who is the Senior Vice President for Global Public Policy for Comcast, where she's responsible for developing and coordinating the company's public policy efforts across the corporation. Jonathan Baker, who is Professor of Law at American University, where he teaches courses on antitrust and economic regulation. He served as Chief Economist of the FCC from 2009 to 2011, and Director of the Bureau of Economics at the FTC, and I think most other Chief Economist type positions at every government agency. Then we have the Honorable Mike O'Reilly, who's an FCC Commissioner. And prior to joining the agency, he was a policy advisor in the office of the Senate Republican Whip, led by U.S. Senator John Cornyn. And he also worked in the Whip's office as an advisor and Deputy Chief of Staff and Policy Director for Senator John Kyle. Bob Quinn is the Senior Vice President for Federal Regulatory and Chief Privacy Officer for AT&T. He's also responsible for customer privacy policies at the international, federal, and state level across all lines of business. And before this, he was the VP for Federal Regulatory Affairs for AT&T in Washington, where he represented AT&T before the FCC and the Department of Justice. And we have David Rettel, who is the Chief Counsel for Communications and Technology on the majority staff of the U.S. House of Representatives on Energy and Commerce, where he advises Chairman Fred Upton and Subcommittee Chairman Greg Walden on communication and technology matters. So one thing I have to point out at the beginning is that I recognize that there isn't exactly balance on the panel, and I mea culpa for that. But I'm going to do my best to add some rebalance on this. So I won't just have John Baker there to take on everything, and hopefully I'll be able to ask some pointed questions to everyone. Okay, now, in addition, I'm going to be watching the Twitter feed, so if anybody has any questions that they want to ask that way, or just a snarky comment that then I can respond to, you could do that too. So let's start with Rebecca. And this, of course, is the big overarching question. And what's going to happen next? What are the FCC and Congress going to do after this decision? And I sort of see this in three parts. First is what happens before the court makes a decision. There's some companies and everyone else has to operate before then. And then there's a possibility that the court overturns the rule, and then there's a possibility that the court doesn't overturn the rule. If you could say that in just a sentence or two.
So, right, yeah. So thanks, Scott. I quit predicting what the government's going to do when I left my job on Wall Street working with Blair, and now I spend my time thinking about what the government should do. And so wanted to lay out a few points on that to tee up for the rest of the discussion. So I think both Congress and the FCC and the other agents should be focused on what is going to grow the economic development of this country, what's going to make sure that the internet space, internet ecosystem as a whole stays on the leading edge in terms of investment and innovation, and that we're also inclusive and bring everybody else along with us. So I think that those are the overriding goals. I was going to start by last year I had 3 parables that I talked about with international issues. This time I had 3 flashbacks. It may be the nature of what the year was like, but the first flashback I had was to the summer when OSTP, there was a salon dinner, OSTP was there talking about doing moonshots and the importance of encouraging industry to do moonshots. And I was sitting there thinking, collectively, we did a moonshot when you think about where the internet space was 15, 20 years ago compared to where we are now. The second flashback I had was sitting in Bill Kennard's office very late one Friday night as we were figuring out what to do with the Stevens report. His decision ultimately to say that internet service is an information service, not a telecom service, and then flash forwarding where he presented at a PPI conference saying that in terms of it being a bipartisan issue, that when he saw a Netroots conference where the two, Obama and Clinton, had to come in and speak and give allegiance to certain net neutrality issues, that he knew that that was the end of sort of good policy and bipartisanship. And then the final flashback I had was further back, 1992, with Carville, the famous quote about the economy stupid. So I think that right now, I think what we're collectively facing and what the government needs to be very mindful of is the fact that although we're not on the mat any longer as we were during the recession, there are still very important structural problems that remain. Our private investment fell off a cliff during the recession, and it has not yet recovered. We're getting close to the levels that it was before the recession, nowhere close to recovering what we lost. Public investment is abysmal in terms of core infrastructure, roads, airports, ports, and the most reliable estimate I've seen is that it would take the public sector $3.6 trillion to just get back up to par. Employment, the good news is that the unemployment levels are down to about a little over 5%. The bad news is that's because a lot of people have just stopped looking for jobs. And so our workforce participation level is at record lows at about 63%, hasn't been that bad for decades. And then finally, our productivity in the US has always been a leader in productivity, is the lowest it's ever been. And so I think that what the FCC and Congress and everybody else needs to do is to make sure that as they're dealing with these issues, they make sure they don't put a drag on what's been a rare success story in the US economy, which has been the internet space. So just to pick up on a couple of points from the prior panel, and partly Howard's points, I think, about whether there's enough facts to do some of this policy making, I think that we have become, a lot of the analysis is becoming very devoid of, I think, genuine analysis and genuine facts. A lot of people have been trash talking the state of the US broadband, internet access, and everybody's got a business model. But I think a lot of it has been just to support increased regulation through Title II in this space. And what I've been looking at are indicia of what I think of as a healthy versus an unhealthy market that would suggest that the government should intervene like they've done with Title II. And I'm happy to talk to people offline, but if you look at sort of 5 basic areas that are important to whether it's a functioning, healthy, vibrant market or not, if you look at price, the ISPs have invested record levels in CapEx. If you look at output, the speeds keep on increasing enormously. We increase our speeds 16 times in the last 13 years. The other ISPs that we compete with are doing a similar thing. We increase our capacity. We double our capacity about every 18 months. So the supply is keeping well in advance of the demand. And all of this has been done while prices have stayed flat. And I think this is something that's underappreciated. If you look at the government's inflation data, ISP access has stayed literally flat during a 5-year period when tuition, college tuition, and I know this firsthand, has gone up 23%, and hospital facilities have gone up 26 or 29%. So our per capacity prices have actually plummeted. Our prices on our flagship product have gone down 92% on a per megabit basis. So I would argue that those are indicia of a healthy functioning market that would suggest that the government should be very reluctant to get involved. And so finally, so what's life going to be like in a post-Title II world, depending on whether the courts overturn it or Congress steps in? I think we're in a period of a requiem for good policy that followed decades of good policy where we've come to the end of that. Policymakers always look to see what they can do to support the internet. I think there's a lot they can do. Spectrum, adoption issues, universal service in the areas that aren't served, immigration, education, but I think at the same time they need to step back and step aside when there are areas that are working well. Title II, I think there are a lot of tough policy issues that we all face together and fight about, but I think Title II was not one of those tough issues. Final point is one of our attorneys, in-house attorneys, talked to the business units to explain what the open internet order meant, and a lot of the people there who are not lawyers and not in DC asked a series of questions about, well, will we be able to do this? Will we be able to do that? And the lawyer said, I can't give you any guidance. And so I would just end by commenting on or flagging the FCC Enforcement Bureau's public notice that they put out maybe a month or two ago. This was to give a framework where companies, ISPs, can get an advisory opinion to provide certainty in our business practices. So if you have a business plan for a new product or a new service, you submit a proposal to the FCC. The proposal, in their words, quote, must be concrete and detailed to allow the Bureau to, quote, conduct an in-depth review. We should include advertisements, engineering analysis, rollout plans, and schedules. The Bureau will then ask other parties, companies, anybody that may be affected by the new product or service for their input. The FCC doesn't promise it'll provide an answer within any particular time or even answer at all. The Bureau is free to rescind or revoke any guidance it gives, and the FCC Commission is free to overrule it. And the Bureau will make its advisory opinion public. Now, if you can imagine all the companies that Tim Bresnahan talked about in the beginning having to go to this process to offer up a new product or service, you can imagine just what a blanket that would put. And I think that's the big problem. We need a culture and a regulatory system that celebrates and supports risk-taking. The internet miracle that we all recognize didn't happen by accident. It was private companies doing private risk-taking with their own capital and the government having a good regulatory system that supported that. So I think what we need to do is maintain the private risk-taking, but to quote Howard, don't go back and repeat the old mistakes that we did in the past, and instead restore good government policymaking. Thanks.
So before we move on, I want to ask, go to Bob next. I'm wondering, so I mean, we have Title II now, and so kind of the debate about whether we should have it is sort of passed, and so either we continue with this current regime, or the court overturns it and we have to have something else. But it's hugely popular. Not that I think popularity is the way we should be making antitrust or regulatory policy, but it's unlikely that an FCC or even Congress maybe will do something radically different. What would you have them do now within the political realities, and how would it be better than sort of just the generic Title II classification?
I think that there has become a conflation of the open internet set of issues and Title II. And I think that open internet and net neutrality are very popular. And I think that, again, going back to Howard's comments about, some of this is economic analysis, some of it is just cultural values. And I think that the open internet, in the beginning, we would have said that you don't need those rules, but as a company, we came to realize that they are very popular. We agreed to follow the open internet rules many times, have not challenged them. I think Title II is a completely different thing, and I think most people have no idea what Title II is in terms of popularity. It has become, we had a policy retreat, a very small one. We only served coffee, but one of the most heated discussions we got into internally was, do facts matter anymore? Or are we just in a period where, when I saw the John Oliver, very funny, but when I saw the Dingo John Oliver story, I thought that's the end of Title II. So we need to figure out, are we going to be in a world where policy is made by John Oliver, or are we going to be in a period where we're actually still doing some facts and analysis? I would encourage Congress, I think it's probably just Congress, to do what they can to pull apart, separate out the open internet or net neutrality rules, which I think there's broad consensus in support of, including from us, from the Title II public utility regulation. Bob,
so where do we go next? What should the FCC and Congress be focusing on?
Well, so Rebecca kind of gave you what they should do. I'm gonna do what she wouldn't do. I'm gonna predict what they're gonna do. How's that? That was the question you originally asked. I think, I think there's a couple of things that are going to happen over the course of the next 12 months. And I think the two big areas that I think the FCC is going to move into are both privacy and rate regulation. And I think the rate regulation will start on the wholesale side. I think they're gearing up in this special access proceeding where, ostensibly what we're supposed to be doing is debating what the price of a 1.5 megabit circuit sold to businesses are. And I think where we're going to end up is we're going to end up with a discussion of whether we should have wholesale rate regulation on fiber facilities and Ethernet services. Because that's where I think that goes. I don't think anybody thinks that the FCC should spend the next 5 years figuring out what we should price a 1.5 megabit dedicated circuit to a company, because nobody uses those anymore. I mean, the demand is going away on those. And I don't think the FCC is going to actually spend the time for the next 5 years, which is what it would take to kind of go and re-regulate all those rates. I think they're going to move over to fiber, and they're going to move to wholesale and Ethernet. And I think that proceeding is going to really start to get underway this year. So I think rate regulation, which is what Title II has always been about, that's going to come, and that process is probably going to start this fall. In the area of privacy, I think the FCC is going to move into that area too. And I think they're going to do privacy rules. And I think the one head scratcher for them is when companies like Google move into the broadband space and their whole business model is really focused on data. How are they going to regulate Google? Well, what we saw in net neutrality is that Title II service isn't a Title II service unless it's offered by an ISP. I'm not really sure where they're going to throw Google in that picture. But one of the things that we've seen over time is, what we were trying to prepare for and what we've been trying to prepare for at AT&T for a long time is these alternative business models, which are coming in and they're very disruptive. And we had to kind of learn a little bit about how to deal with those. We have basically a subscription-based model. That's what it's been historically. But we've had to experiment in these other areas. And I think the commission is going to come down in the area of privacy, and they're going to make it very hard for ISPs to be able to change into alternative business models, which I think is unfortunate. I think it's not what consumers want. And I think we're going to struggle with that. And the most disturbing thing that I heard recently was that rather than do an NOI and try to kind of create the record to understand what this world looks like and whether or not ISPs sit in a unique situation in terms of the types of data and information that they have versus web-based technology companies like Google, I think the unfortunate thing is I've heard they want to move directly to a rulemaking and not do the NOI step and not take a bunch of comments to really kind of understand what the status quo is, which would indicate to me that it's really more politically driven to do something as opposed to the other. And Scott, I can't help but point out your hugely popular comment. I'm going to point out to you that George Bush, right after he invaded Kuwait, or right after he went to fight Iraq after Kuwait, had the highest approval ratings 18 months before he got thrown out of office. So there's a lot of historical references to that show that in hindsight, those decisions aren't always, even if they're popular at the time, in hindsight, they don't necessarily make lasting policy.
When you said you think rate regulation will start this fall, what did you mean by that?
Well, I think the FCC has collected a lot of information on the special access proceeding, and they keep postponing the comment deadlines in that docket and expanding the scope of what they're going to look at in that docket. And so at some point this fall, they're going to make that data available so that they can open up a rulemaking on what to do about regulation in the special access area. And so when I say this fall, I mean, I think that's when this proceeding is really going to get going. And I think one of the critical aspects of that proceeding is going to be what the FCC intends to do on fiber and Ethernet regulation.
Let me ask one more thing. This relates to your comment about public opinion being fickle. Somebody pointed out on Twitter that I had said that if Title II gets overturned, you have to have something, and that's a false choice. And of course, that comment was right. But don't make me look bad again. But what would happen if it were overturned? Do you see the FCC trying to still promote some kind of open internet order, or would it just fade away?
You know, and then maybe this is where I'll go back to kind of where Rebecca went. I mean, what we ought to do, and I think Howard discussed this as well. I think Howard is really right. I think that this is kind of really a very philosophical debate about an agency that's kind of where one part of the industry or one part of the activist community is trying to push them, in the absence of data that demonstrates that there's a problem, trying to push them to say, we need to act now, we've got to do this before we see a problem. Because if we see a problem, it's going to be too late, versus where the industry has traditionally been, which is, hey, you know, we adhere to net neutrality, and we don't believe that you need to act in this area because there really hasn't been a problem that hasn't been fixed relatively quickly. I think that the day after the court overturns this order, if that's the hypothetical you're giving me, nothing happens. All of these companies have in place transparency policies and how we operate the network. We all have adhered to those policies. We adhered to those policies during the 18 months between when the Comcast order came out and when the new rules were ordered by the FCC. Nothing's going to happen. Nothing is going to change. The internet is not going to become a closed sphere that closes down innovation for all these companies. And I think it's really more of a longer term look as to what the right policy is for government intervention in this area. And I think that in the absence of that, you know, maybe Congress will act, and maybe something will move. I think, you know, the next big barometer I think that's going to hit is going to be the oral argument. I was hopeful that what we would see this summer is movement towards bipartisan legislation, because really the issues that are teed up in this appeal are pretty fundamental. They're taking on, you know, the industry and the appellants have taken on the 706 authority, they've taken on the Title II authority, they've taken on the authority to regulate wireless. At any point in time, if FCC loses any one of those arguments, I think they've got a huge hole, and I think the need for some kind of legislative solution to that is going to grow. So I was hopeful that this summer we would kind of see movement in that direction. It didn't really happen. But David's the expert, and I'm dying to hear what he has to say on this topic. But
Shoved you right in front of that bus, didn't you, Bob? Shoved you right in front of that bus.
I tried to. But I mean, so I'm hopeful that something will happen, but I'm kind of thinking that the next thing that's going to happen is really going to be the oral argument. And I think if the Democrats in Congress who you know, it just doesn't seem that there's an overwhelming number of Democrats in Congress willing to take this issue on right now. But if they get a sense that the oral argument, for example, doesn't go well, you know, maybe we'll have a renewed sense of coming up with one coherent policy from the U.S. government out of Congress that kind of tells us how we're going to proceed in the future.
Well, that seems like a pretty good place to find out what Congress is going to do. So you're going to tell us exactly what Congress is going to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, both of you hit the nail on the head in different respects. You know, Bob, I think you're spot on that the oral arguments will be the next point where folks on the Hill start to reconsider whether or not there's more traction to do something on net neutrality. I don't think personally that will be the tipping point. I think everyone is going to wait to see how it turns out because there are so many different ways the DC Circuit could rule here. They could rule procedure, they could rule on the substance, they could rule just on wireless, they could rule on wireline. There's so many different ways that this could turn out. I personally don't anticipate that some of the folks who have been the most ardent supporters of Title II on Capitol Hill are going to move unless it is completely struck down. I wish that were not the case, but it seems that is where folks have been up to this point. Because as it turns out, my boss has offered something that would have provided a path forward for net neutrality. And I think it's important to draw that bifurcation here. The Open Internet Order is not about net neutrality. The Open Internet Order is about providing the FCC a way to regulate the internet. They are not the same thing. We're going to see where the FCC wants to go on privacy. this fall. They've told us they're going to go forward. And we know that they believe that they can go further than 222 says in terms of CP&I. We've already seen an enforcement bureau that's gone after a telephone provider for the release of PII, which traditionally has not been within the FCC's bailiwick. We know that they're going to move forward at some point on the special access proceeding, as Bob raised.
Can you just say what PPNI is?
Sure, PII being personally identifiable information as opposed to CPNI, which is what the FCC has traditionally had authority over, which is customer proprietary network information, which of course is the information from the telephone days that would have been the information your telephone provider had, but they could not make available to the public without a warrant. So we're seeing them go further. We saw in the Yorktel case that Social Security numbers were one of the things that were part of the issue in that case, and that is not traditionally something that has been part of the telephony world. We're also, to sort of double back on some of the things that Rebecca brought up, I think in terms of what we can do in the short term, you saw us start to tee that up in July. The committee had a hearing on promoting investment in broadband infrastructure. And that's a place that we think that the subcommittee in particular can rise above the debate that's been going on in terms of classification and address issues that have been a part of the debate about investment in broadband infrastructure regardless of classification. We were really pleased with the way the hearing turned out. We're working with our colleagues across the aisle over the summer to try and find things we can move forward on in the fall to try and reduce barriers to entry and reduce barriers to investment that everyone's been talking about for 10 years but have been challenging to tackle. So we're really excited about trying to tackle some of those issues, both on the wired side and on the wireless side. Because as Rebecca brought up, spectrum is the piece that seems to perennially be on everyone's mind but get lost in this shuffle. And we did some work in the Middle Class Tax Relief Act a couple years ago to improve tower siting. We're going to continue working on that aspect of this, 6409A of that bill, of that law. Improved siting and tried to make government buildings more accessible. We think that there's more work to be done there to make the facilities of the federal government available to people who are trying to improve our network infrastructure in the country. That's our short-term look, and I think we're all going to be wondering sort of how oral argument goes and what the ultimate outcome of this case is.
Okay, so from Commissioner O'Reilly, of course we want to hear from them from the FCC's perspective. Where things go now, what your reaction is to what you've heard, whether you see a future for this rule, whether it gets fleshed out more or.
Well, sure. I'm happy to comment on the discussion. I should say, fair as most everyone knows, I did not support what the commission did, and they don't often tell me what they're planning to do. So some of this will be my guessing. But in fairness, in some regards, we are going to be occupied by other issues until the court makes some decision. We have this thing called the incentive auction that the chairman has teed up for the first quarter of next year. That has taken a considerable amount of time. We have other issues. But on the topic itself, I was writing down a couple different ideas that I think will probably be in our play in the bailiwick. We will likely be soliciting potential violations from the outside, trying to capture the best claims against in violations of the rules and trying to see if we can litigate them. We will, at the same time, probably threaten providers with enforcement actions based on vague claims and trying to push them in a direction separate from the commissioner level. I think we'll also be on a course to expand our authority, which is as one thing I would take point with the previous panel. The discussion in the title dealt with the rise and fall of the regulatory state, and there's the analysis from the previous panel was how much has regulation increased. And my argument is certainly as it pertains to net neutrality or the commission itself, it hasn't necessarily been the rules per se. It has been the power grab and the authority in the assertion of the right to regulate at a future time period. So we have grown the scale of what the commission can do in the future, and I think we'll continue to do that. And one issue that's been talked about on the panel already, and I think is very clear. I've already talked about this extensively and written about it. I think we're going to do something on the privacy security debate this fall. I think that will be problematic for a number of different reasons. I think we'll in the next 6 to 9 months, we'll probably undo a number of promises that were made as part of net neutrality. We'll see some of the forbearance be chipped away in decisions that are made, and we'll continue to do some of those things where people were promised certain things and they'll no longer be carried out. And it goes along to Rebecca's point. I think in the advisory opinions, which I mentioned long ago, I think we'll issue some of those to people who are daring enough to come in and ask for one. And I think they'll either be useless or they'll actually be harmful. So I think that's something that we're happy to do. I would make a point that there was made, there's this question, I think Scott raised the question, well, net neutrality is very popular. And I always go back, and I appreciate that David went before me, because my direction and my authority at the commission, at least in my viewpoint, comes from the Congress and the statute. And in nowhere do I remember spending my time in looking at the statute, anywhere does it reference some kind of privacy, or some kind of popularity measurement in the discussion. Popularity is not measured or mentioned in the early part in the commission's formation, and it shouldn't be. So I think those are kind of the capture of where I think things are going in the next, till a decision's made, or, 9 months, 10 months, at least in the short term.
Well, to put it in the context in the context of the previous panel, why is it now that the Commission has shifted so strongly towards the precautionary principle, as opposed to tackling problems as they arise?
I don't have a great answer. I'm not the best person to articulate why they have gone this approach. I did appreciate Howard's kind of separation of the two, and I certainly fall in the first category versus the second category. There's certainly precautions, and you want to be diligent to know what's happening in the marketplace. There's another to have this paranoia on what you think might happen at some point, and you have no proof of it, but we want to regulate in the... I don't know what has made the majority go this direction. Obviously, people have raised the political question, but it's extremely problematic from my viewpoint.
John, I'd like to ask two questions. First, again, going back to the previous panel, what do you think the role of economic analysis has been in the open internet debate, and how you saw it at the FCC while you were there, although that was before this. And the second one, and I asked this one second because I think that will get some reaction from others, is that there's the implicit assumption in some others' comments that Title II will reduce investment. What do you make of that claim?
Well, those are two huge questions, so thank you.
Right.
And I will try and take less time than Roger took in the previous panel. Thank you, Roger, for the help. So I think the FCC's analysis is, in the current order and the 2010 order, is infused with economics. It's not just about free expression or cultural values or John Oliver or reflecting the good sense of the American people in supporting an open internet. It's also about economics. And the orders explain that the internet's a general purpose technology. It's that innovation's propelled by a virtuous cycle and that there are threats to slowing the cycle from the broadband providers. They can harm competition by raising the edge provider costs for selected edge providers, for example, ones that compete with an affiliate of the broadband provider, or ones that are paid that pay the broadband provider in order to get a competitive edge over rivals. And the broadband providers can exploit their terminating monopoly, their gatekeeper position, and charge excessive prices if they're allowed to do paid prioritization. And they have an incentive to slow degrade the service quality of the normal internet, or at least slow its expansion in order to induce edge providers to shift to priority service. So there are all sorts of potential problems here. And this is an economic analysis, in many respects a competition analysis, but economic more generally. And the DC Circuit found that this entire framework and approach in economic analysis was reasonable and grounded in substantial evidence. And they told the FCC
that was all sufficient to ground the transparency rule in the previous case, and essentially told the FCC you have to reclassify to deal with blocking, throttling, paid prioritization, the other things that are the part of the rule. And so what the FCC did in reclassifying isn't a power grab at all. It's just simply following the roadmap set forth by the DC Circuit. And if the same panel decides the current case has decided the last one, I would think they would uphold what the FCC has done. So that's my view about the economic analysis.
Do you object to it being called the precautionary principle in this case? Or do you think it's just an economic analysis?
I think there's it's correct to say that there's a concern that the harms would be hard to reverse. It's costly to reverse, and you can't reclaim the lost competition easily if you've discouraged entry from new sources of new technologies. You never know what you've discouraged, and you'll never get it back. And so there's a sense in which there are harms from allowing the kind of practices that the rule prevents to go forward that are large and irreversible. And in that sense, you could call what is being done the precautionary principle, but this isn't like environmental regulation in the use of that term there. It's just the way in which one would conduct a cost-benefit analysis in this particular industry. And then as far as investment goes, well, the investment we're talking about is the virtuous cycle, and it involves the edge providers as well as the broadband providers. And we don't want to just, we want to encourage edge provider investment. We want to encourage avoid chilling new competition, new ways of doing business, new technologies that we don't know what they are going to be. I mean, can you imagine, Mark Zuckerman starting up now? Well, if he had to pay for priority service, that's a hugely different environment. He has to, he'd be an investment banker, not creating Facebook. And then as for broadband investment, well, broadband, I understand the argument that I think the fighting issue here is probably paid prioritization, and the argument of the broadband providers would be that if they could charge both sides of the market, they could make more money, and that would encourage investment. But of course, greater edge investment also encourages broadband investment, and we've had the ban on paid prioritization for a couple of years under the 2010 order without discouraging broadband investment. There's no indication that past investment was ever based on the expectation that the broadband providers would be able to charge for priority service. I understand the arguments, but I don't see I think the Commission was appropriately thinking about the edge and core as a whole, and came to a reasonable conclusion that the Open Internet Order would benefit investment overall.
Rebecca, and then David.
Just a couple of responses. I think Jonathan didn't summarize the Commission's investment analysis in the order. I think he gave the full total of it. So, and I don't think that the issue really now is about paid prioritization. I think that paid prioritization, I would quote Richard Bennett about, do we want an Amish version of the internet where we never let anything progress? Nobody, at least in my company, was planning on doing paid prioritization. We agreed to drop it as a pure policy matter as opposed to a popularity issue. I'm not persuaded that that's the right long-term thing, but we were willing to go with it. The real issue isn't paid prioritization, which is really hypothetical harms versus a hypothetical business model. The real issue is Title II. And it's very important to keep that in mind. And then in terms of the investment issue, just two data points. One is There was a study that showed the amount of money that was invested over the last, I think from 2011 to 2013, 3 years, by both edge providers and the ISPs, the network operators. And ISPs invested 84% of the CapEx that was going in that period of time. Christopher Yu, as probably many of you know, did a study that looked at investment, looked at a lot of stuff, but comparing the EU and the US. And one of his findings, empirical findings, was that on a per household basis, the US has more than twice as much investment on a per household basis than the EU does in internet access. And then he did regression analysis that led him to conclude that a large part of that differential was on the Title II-like regulatory regime that the European Union has versus the relatively unregulated that the US does.
David?
Yeah, I just want to chime in. I keep hearing this argument every time we have the debate of open internet or net neutrality about the virtuous cycle and how that's the rationale for why the FCC did what it did. But the idea behind the virtuous cycle is an equilibrium of reciprocal incentives. And what the FCC did by unbalancing those incentives and by unbalancing the uncertainty is pick sides. It's old school side choosing. You draw a line down the middle and you say, are you with the edge guys or are you with the core guys? They drew a line down the middle and said, we're with the edge guys on this one. And we're going to unbalance things. We're going to tip the scales a little bit towards the edge guys because we think we need to help them out some more. It's not about the virtuous cycle. The virtuous cycle is working just fine. It's why we keep seeing investment. It's why we keep seeing companies springing up out of Silicon Valley and Silicon Alley and everywhere else that we're seeing the kind of investment we want to see in the edge community. If that's the rationale the FCC is giving, I think they've misplaced their ideals.
Well, can I jump in on that point? And I appreciate David's analysis and the line drawing. And I would argue that if his construct is correct, where they've picked the edge providers, I would just say to any edge provider, and I've made this point before, we're coming for you next. So it's not like, we might have drawn the line here, today. Tomorrow we're drawing it over here. You just happen to be on the wrong side of the line. So I worry about that as well.
Why didn't anyone's stock price react to the Title II change?
I mean, nobody understands it. I think this goes back to the first question that people said. People understand net neutrality. Most people don't understand what Title II means. I mean, the reality is that's just how it is, at least in the general public. Wall Street's different, obviously. But
And I think, what our shareholders would love if we stopped investing. Our stock price would go up if we announced we were reducing our CapEx investment.
And do dividends instead?
Yeah,
or
just,
whatever.
not spend that money.
Oh, we should go to questions at some point, so if you have any, let me know.
Maybe can others react to the stock price question?
Sure. Are you one of those people who would like to? Oh, yeah, any other, actually,
Well,
John?
I mean, one of the things that one of the talking points that was repeated over and over again was how this wasn't going to be, your grandmother's Title II. This was going to be light touch regulation, and it wasn't going to involve rate regulation. My prediction is it will involve rate regulation, and when rate regulation happens, you're going to see the stock prices react accordingly.
That's right.
I think, there were a lot of talking points to say that's not what this is all about. This was about paid prioritization. This is about not blocking. This is about all the things that people were already committed to not do. But I think when the rate regulation kind of rears up its head, which is going to happen, I think that's when you're going to see the market start saying, whoa, time out.
I agree with that.
This gets into sort of legal questions that I'm not qualified to know about, but some have argued that in the absence of Title II, it's hard for the FCC, it's not clear where the FCC's authority comes to deal with issues like the tech transition, what's called the IP transition, 911 issues, rural call completion. Is that true?
I'll give you my opinion on that. I've never believed that. For the last 10 years, particularly as it relates to interconnected VoIP, the Commission has been able to expand 911 to those services without declaring those services to be Title II services. Those decisions have been appealed. They have won those appeals. And I think that in terms of maintaining the public safety aspects of communications, I don't think that the FCC had any problem doing that without resorting to declaring all VoIP providers to be Title II service providers, which is the ultimate irony here, right, is that the one service that the Communications Act of *34 was designed to regulate was VoIP, and that's the service they haven't declared to be a Title II service. I just think that's kind of ironic, right? So I just disagree with that notion completely. I also don't believe that that the Comcast court told the FCC to go down the Title II road. I think they said...
The Verizon court.
Verizon court, I'm sorry. Verizon, Comcast. Well, we appealed this. This will be the AT&T
Right, this is the
decision,
AT&T
right?
decision,
Is-
But I don't think the Verizon court told them to go down the Title II road, and I think that there was a path that I think even Chairman Wheeler contemplated going down, where he thought that he could reinstitute all of the rules that were in place before without going down Title II.
Before the movie.
Before the movie.
Wouldn't the FCC still have some price regulation authority, even under 706? They can look into anti-discriminatory price discrimination and so on. I mean, if they wanted to regulate prices, couldn't they do so without Title II?
I mean, I think the Verizon courts the two-person majority Verizon courts interpretation of 706 and the reliance on the double bank shot virtuous cycle, I think arguably is rather standardless and limitless, and so the answer is probably yes. I think that at some point courts come in and start disciplining that, and so I think that that's why the Title II regime has decades worth of incrustation around it that it's easier to invoke. I think the 706 is kind of uncharted territory for ill or good.
Right. Jonathan, did you have something you were looking at?
No,
Okay. Let's take some questions.
I'm gonna
yes, please.
jump in and just say that I think it would have been, I agree with Rebecca that the way that the Verizon court, I got that right this time, the way that the Verizon court interpreted 706, it did almost seem like not only could they regulate our rates, but I always thought that under that decision they could go a lot farther
Yep.
than ISPs. Because once you start talking about the virtuous cycle of investment, if you had like for example, a giant search firm that was engaged in anti-competitive behavior that was preventing, that was arguably inhibiting other people from entering that market or entering that space, under the virtuous cycle rationale that was out there, I don't see where you draw the line to say that the FCC's authority extends only to ISPs, because at the end of the day, whether we're talking about Microsoft or we're talking about Apple or Google, they're all providing information services. And the FCC, in the Stevens report, made it very, very clear that it has jurisdiction over information service providers. So I've always felt that was a very broad authority, but I will say there's nothing, I mean, they would have had to take the step of basically saying, we're going to take reasonable rate requirements out of Title II and put them in this space as well. And that would really make their authority kind of boundless at that point. And I'm not sure that would have ever stood up.
I have answered my viewpoints on Section 706 many a day. I disagree with the court's interpretation. I do agree with the panelists that, as currently interpreted, it's pretty much limitless, and that is extremely problematic from my perspective. The question was, I think, originally, does the FCC have authority to do certain things absent Title II declaration or even 706? And my argument is, if that's not the case, if the Commission does not have that authority, we have a remedy, which is to go to the Congress and talk to them and ask them to change it. If they, in their wisdom, decide to do so, then that's one thing. If they decide in their wisdom not to do something and they spend time on other things or whatever, that's their decision. That is what we, as Americans, elect the people in the Congress for. And so that's where our authority is supposed to come from, rather than interpreting any provision we want at any given moment to do whatever we want. I do believe that the current Commission just doesn't believe in the law. The law is just a barrier for a couple people in the General Counsel's office to figure out how to get around.
The irony of this conversation is that the group of panelists who claim not to accept the precautionary principle when talking about how to regulate the internet are talking about a precautionary principle of their own, where they're worried about they're making up potential harms of regulation from the FCC that are not on the horizon, and they're saying we should do things now to stop that. And so they're adopting their own precautionary principle in reverse. And I think we should actually look at what the FCC did here, which was it didn't adopt Title II until essentially instructed by the DC Circuit that was the way in which it had to reclassify in order to get its rules adopted or enforced. And then when it did so, it did so while simultaneously forbearing from something like 700 rules under Title II. And I know that the rest of the panel would want to have them forbear from 701 or 2 or 3, but if you look at what they did, this is not about a power grab, regulation by the FCC. This is about the open internet and protecting the non-discrimination on the internet for the good of competition and investment, but also other values like free expression.
It's kind of hard to not see it as a power grab when a direct result of the reclassification was the preemption of the Federal Trade Commission. It's kind of hard to not see that as a power grab.
And I just,
That was an unintended and
It was a directly intended consequence.
It was definitely it was a foreseeable consequence. I agree with that. And an unfortunate one. I agree as well that the FCC and the FTC ought to have concurrent jurisdiction over particularly consumer protection issues where they have different kinds of expertise and backgrounds, and that would be all to the good, and that would be something useful for Congress to do to say, well, now we accept that the Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Communications Commission is reclassified, and what we need to do now is say that the Federal Trade Commission should no longer be subject to an exemption, based on
So I just want to be
common
clear,
carriage.
as a result of the FCC's reclassification, you think that Congress should double down on 2 regulators for the internet instead of 1?
I think concurrent jurisdiction is a good thing here because the 2 agencies work together and they have different kinds of expertise. The FTC has a lot of expertise on consumer protection, and the FCC has a lot of expertise on how the communications industry
Isn't
works.
that exactly how it worked before the reclassification?
Yes, and you should, but the reclassification was needed. Not the point. The point of the reclassification wasn't to divest the FTC of Consumer Protection Authority. It was because the DC Circuit instructed the Federal Communications Commission that if you want to protect the open internet, you have to reclassify. And this is just an unfortunate consequence that you should fix.
I'm not sure that's exactly
That's
the
a very
reading of the
interesting
Verizon
reading
decision.
of the case.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's exactly what the court said.
Can I just jump in real quick? The institutional power grab to me are like the least interesting issues, which is why I'm not a political person. The precautionary, I would agree, Jonathan, with you about they were being a bit hypocritical about, on the one hand saying we're not enamored of a precautionary principle, and on the other hand not giving the FCC the benefit of the doubt, and they only do it when they were forced to by the Verizon court. But I think that the factual predicates are really wrong, or let me put it another way, this isn't my first rodeo, which is the FCC initially after the Verizon court decision came out with a proposal that actually didn't go to Title II. They weren't forced by the court, they were forced by the movement. So the first point. The second point, in terms of give them a benefit of the doubt and see where they end up, the Enforcement Bureau advisory opinion guidance that I read from, I think is an early warning indicator that they're not going to be restrained as they go forward.
Well, let me say one thing about that, because that guidance you were reading was setting up a voluntary system
I know.
for achieving advisory opinions. Nobody's required to do
I
any
know.
of that, and this is what the Federal Trade Commission and the Justice Department already do, and it's just adopting a similar process. I just don't see how you can get upset about that.
I'm going to push back on that because I don't think that, I agree with you, the process is labeled as voluntary. There's a direct warning in there that if you guys go out and you introduce services and you haven't engaged in this process, it's going to be held against you. So I understand that the label on it is voluntary, Jonathan. I just disagree with you that that was intended to be a voluntary process.
It's sort of like voluntary merger conditions.
Oh, please. Don't go there.
All right, questions? Yeah.
Hi, Lynn Stanton from TR Daily. David, you said that you thought that unless the court completely struck down Title II, there'd be no incentive for those who are supporters of Title II on the Hill to negotiate over legislation. In the opposite situation, well, in the same situation, if Title II is completely struck down, is there any incentive for those who oppose Title II and may not be completely enamored of all the open internet rules to begin with to negotiate on legislation?
Well, I don't think I was quite that definitive that supporters of Title II in full wouldn't be for it unless it's struck down completely. I think there are some people who are going to be for Title II no matter what happens in the court. If it's struck down, if it's kept, just like there are some that are going to always believe we should have no regulation of internet service provision. I think when we see what comes out, we're going to have to see where the chips fall on Capitol Hill. There's no easy way to say where people fall on open internet net neutrality. It's like asking somebody on Capitol Hill about their thoughts on cybersecurity. Ask 100 people, you're going to get 100 wildly different answers. And net neutrality is the same way. There are so many aspects of it that have become part of the dogma of this. For some folks, the open internet order now encompasses interconnection, and it now encompasses privacy, and it encompasses a whole host of things that were never part of the 2010 rules or were never part of the discussions in the earlier iterations of what ultimately became the open internet order. And so I don't think it's easy to say that, oh yes, we'll find that after this happens, we'll find people in one of three camps. I wish it were. It would make my job a lot easier. But the reality is there are so many competing viewpoints, we're just going to have to wait to see how it pans out before I can give any kind of a roadmap for what congressional outlook's going to look like.
Yeah, I don't think there's, so if we were to lose the appeal, let's say Jonathan's right, we end up in front of the same panel and we get an order that affirms the decision, we live in a Title II world. So, I don't think there's anything left to negotiate. I doubt that any of the ISPs would sign up to put Title II into legislation. I just don't think that if that's the world that we end up living in and those are that becomes the final order, I just don't see, I don't see there being a big impetus to say, oh, let's codify that into a law.
Can I answer it this way? And I am removed from that for 20 months or so, but I will suggest that in my past life, there were a percentage of members who don't see the necessity of these rules because they kind of fall into Howard's camp from before. They want to actually see real harms. They actually want to have facts. They want to, rather than just be made up. And so they actually believe in that. And so they are interested. And so this is the best time. I realize that advocates believe, and I've said this before, advocates who support Title II have shown no interest in negotiating. But this is the best time for them to find something. And I defer to the Congress on how best to resolve that. But if the court, and your premise, or under such a conclusion, I believe there is a good portion of people who will say, well, then that was tried and attempted and move on, and there is going to be no, the winner, the leverage will have moved, and the winner will have shifted, and then there will be a great interest in not doing this highly popular item, even though people don't know what the heck it is.
Yeah, Roger.
I've been trying to, for the four camels nose people, I've been trying very hard to understand your argument, and I frankly just don't get it. It seems to me that the ridiculously long, I don't know if anybody can read the whole thing without going to sleep, but the ridiculously long order about net neutrality goes into elaborate length about not doing most of the damage that could be done by Title II. If the FCC ever wanted to rescind that, they would have to bear an evidentiary burden. That is to say, there would be this requirement that a court would ask them the magic question, like happened with regard to the classification of information services. Why have you changed your mind? And what is the basis for the belief that the FCC could ever win that argument? Even if Commissioner O'Reilly is right that three of his colleagues are these evil incarnate, let's reestablish economic regulation over everything types, they still have to get it past the courts. And I just don't see why that's plausible.
Well, I think it's interesting that you believe the FCC has to live by an evidentiary standard to overturn something, since we just saw in the long, and I have read it all the way through multiple painful times, that they haven't really made an evidentiary showing why they're switching from information services to telecom services, other than because it doesn't suit our purposes. If this is indeed upheld by the DC Circuit, then we are living in a world where Chevron deference extends so far that I'm not sure it would matter what the FCC said in deciding to change its mind later about forbearance. Right. That's just the reality of the judicial landscape we're living in.
So let me answer your question this way. Yeah, I agree with David's point that the document is lacking in this when it has shifted its position. It basically said, to the extent we believed it one way before, we no longer believe that, and we don't go through and explain how we have changed our opinion. I think that's a lacking point to the item, and I think the court will examine that, and we'll see who's right in that interpretation. But to your point, in terms of the lengthy, the issue of forbearance came up, and I've talked about this as well. All of the items they forborne from can be done in Section 201 and there's interpretation. So if that's the case, you didn't need all these other things. You have your main provision right here, and you can do everything there, including all the rate regulation you need. And you can just see items that have come since then where we have sought and used 201 for that purpose. And it's been in security, it's been in the tech transitions, and it's creeping into almost every item we're doing. It's in Lifeline, it's in a number of different things where 201 is becoming a linchpin of every activity. So if you believe in forbearance, I've made the argument it's forbearance, but you're going to see everything go into Title I. To 201, excuse me. If you read, and I'm sorry that you won't have access to this, but in the earlier versions of the document, it basically said, and I've made this point publicly, it basically said, to the extent that we, forbear or forborne from one provision over here, we have 201 authority to do exactly what we want to do at a later time. So I don't see where the justification provides.
And well, Mike brings up a good point, which is that a lot of the other portions of Title II are limiting factors on 201, 202 authority. So by forbearing from the limiting factors, they've just given themselves more authority than they had before.
All right, I think we'd better stop. So we're moving right on to the next panel, right, Tom? Yeah, right on to the next panel. So please join me in thanking the panelists.